Good afternoon, everyone. Could I please ask you all to take your seats so we can get underway? I think there may be a couple of seats still available, so if you're standing up, see if you can squeeze in. Otherwise, feel free to sit on the stairs. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michelle Foster. I'm the Director of the Peter McMullin Centre on Statelessness, and I'd like to offer all of you a very warm welcome to today's special event here at Melbourne Law School. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Melbourne is situated on the lands and waters of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Sovereignty has never been ceded. We at the Peter McMullin Centre are thrilled to host the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. Filippo Grandi, today, and to facilitate this opportunity for all of you to hear from the leading advocate globally for refugees, stateless persons and displaced persons. We acknowledge the presence of the UNHCR Director of the Regional Bureau for Asia and Pacific, Erika, and the UNHCR Regional Representative for Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific, Adrian Edwards. We're also honoured to be joined by the Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, Jane Hanson, AO, the generous and steadfast supporter of work to address statelessness, Peter McMullin, AM, and Chief Justice Deborah Mortimer, as well as so many other distinguished guests, colleagues and students. I also wish to acknowledge those of you in the audience today that have lived experience of refugee status and statelessness. It was 5 years ago that we were very fortunate that the High Commissioner was able to appear at the launch of the Peter McMullin Centre on Statelessness, admittedly by a pre-recorded video. To be stateless is to be without a nationality. It's a condition that afflicts millions of people globally. As the High Commissioner noted back at the Centre's launch, the consequences of statelessness are cruel. Without their nationality and the protection that this brings, stateless people are often systematically marginalised and excluded, and their fundamental rights denied. Since that time, the plight of the stateless and that of many other persons of concern to the UNHCR has been exacerbated by so many factors, by the pandemic, by ongoing and new conflicts, and by the inability of the global community to address protracted situations of forced displacement. And yet, the work of the UN Agency for Refugees, the UNHCR, continues on, providing practical, on-the-ground assistance, undertaking refugee status determination, advising governments, running the I Belong campaign to eradicate statelessness, and inspiring all of us to uphold fundamental principles of international protection. In that context, it is timely and an honour to hear the High Commissioner share his insights on displacement and protection, global challenges. In his role as High Commissioner, Mr. Grandi heads one of the world's largest humanitarian organisations. UNHCR has twice won the Nobel Peace Prize. Its 18,000-strong workforce spans 135 countries, providing protection and assistance to over 103 million refugees, returnees, stateless people and internally displaced people. Before being elected High Commissioner in 2016, Mr. Grandi had been engaged in international cooperation for over 30 years, focusing on refugee and humanitarian work. He served as Commissioner General of the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, from 2010 to 2014, after having been the organisation's Deputy Commissioner General from 2005. It is an enormous honour to welcome you to the podium, High Commissioner.
Thank you, Michelle, for your introduction. And thank you all for coming here today. Good afternoon. My very special thanks go also to Erika, our former colleague at UNHCR and a dear friend, for being a driving force for this event and for my visit here to Australia. Very happy to be here. I would also like to show my respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, of elders past and present, on which this event takes place. And I would like to thank, of course, Chancellor, to thank the University of Melbourne and especially the Law School for having invited me, and the McMullin Centre on Statelessness, which I have just visited. I'm grateful for the centre and to its benefactors, the McMullins, for the generous support to the study and eradication of statelessness. The Centre is the only one of its kind, or almost the only one of its kind in the world, and a steadfast partner. I appreciate what is done here for stateless people and encourage your continued work in this much needed endeavor, especially, as you said, Michelle, as we're coming to the end of the I Belong campaign next year. The fight doesn't stop with the campaign. So, dear friends, I'm here, as I said, as part of my first trip to Australia as United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, 11 years after the last visit of a High Commissioner, my predecessor, Antonio Guterres. Much has changed in the intervening period, as you all know, with the world in many ways more complicated and complex. Geopolitical divisions, evident in the inability of the Security Council to prevent and resolve conflict, have aggravated the suffering of people around the world. The COVID-19 pandemic brought us to a standstill. The growing climate emergency wreaks havoc on us all, especially those that have done the least to contribute to this global crisis. Our economies are under pressure, deepening inequalities, anxieties, and frustrations, particularly, once again, for the most vulnerable. It is obvious that to solve these challenges, we must work together, and that we all have very clear responsibilities in addressing them, especially those of us blessed by geography and resources. In this, Australia is a critical player. As a dynamic UN member state, an active bilateral and multilateral partner, a generous donor to United Nations organizations like mine. But being part of the international community also means upholding international law and responsibilities, including when it comes to asylum seekers and refugees. The 1951 Refugee Convention is quite clear and, by the way, quite right in this respect. Refugees are a collective international responsibility. I would be remiss if I did not say, but you all know it, that in recent years we have had some tough conversations with the government of Australia on its domestic refugee policies, and especially the practice of exiling those who came by boat to distant offshore locations, placing them in open-ended detention and putting their lives literally in limbo. These policies have carried immense human and financial costs. They have caused anguish and suffering. The young survivor of these policies this morning quoted to me a verse from a poem she wrote while in Nauru. I quote, "We are under control for no crime," unquote. Some who came in search of protection instead tragically took their own lives. This asylum denial practice has also set a dangerous precedent, as we feared, for other countries to follow similar objectionable paths. While therefore we continue to disagree with this policy, we must commend some recent pronouncements of the new Australian government, namely the welcome decision to provide permanent status for those on temporary visas. And I'm very much encouraged, let me tell you, by the open and frank discussions held during my visit here in the last few days on the complex matters, for example, of detention and on the residual offshore caseload. Discussions which we at UNHCR will continue to pursue in a renewed spirit of dialogue and cooperation. I also wish to put on record my appreciation for the efforts of this government, to find a better balance between its obligations and its concerns, and to increase commitments to important refugee protection programs, such as resettlement and other pathways, as I heard from the Prime Minister a few days ago. Friends, when my predecessor visited 11 years ago, there were about 40 million forcibly displaced people in the world. Today, there are more than 103 million. Last year, UNHCR declared more than 35 new emergencies, meaning an average of one roughly every 10 days. We live in a world in turmoil, and one in which threats and fragility increasingly compel people to flee. One thing that hasn't changed, however, is that most refugees and displaced people stay as close to their countries as possible. Because contrary to perceptions, usually refugees want to go back home. Almost 90% of the forcibly displaced people in the world are, therefore, in low and middle-income countries. This percentage was even higher until the flight of millions of Ukrainians throughout Europe. But most Afghans, for example, are in Iran and Pakistan, Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, Syrian refugees in Turkey, Jordan, and in Lebanon, where 1 in 4 people in a very small country is a refugee. My point is that while the refugee and displacement crisis is enormous, of global importance, and requires international cooperation, the bulk of this crisis is in countries closest to those in conflict. So it is not, despite what some media and politicians continue to repeat, it is not an emergency in wealthy countries. It is not an emergency here in Australia either. I do not, however, understate or underestimate the challenges posed by large population movements, especially so-called mixed movements of refugees and others who choose to move for different reasons. For example, towards the US southern border, across the Mediterranean into Europe, to the United Kingdom, towards South Africa, or across many states in Asia. Those moving along these routes include people fleeing conflict, as well as others escaping persecution, poverty, bad governance, the effects of climate change, and so on. Often, root causes are a mix of these factors. And people on the move use the same routes and fall prey to the same traffickers and smugglers. Not everybody on the move meets the threshold necessary for international refugee protection. All have rights, though different sets of rights. All, without distinction, have a rightful claim to dignified treatment. These mixed flows, however, are difficult to address. One complicating and confusing factor is that many opt to seek asylum as the only available means to obtain legal stay. As a result, asylum systems become overwhelmed. States are often unable to return to their countries people recognized as not being in need of international protection. These are no doubt real challenges, but to which there are better and certainly more humane and legally sound responses than ones based purely on deterrence. Far too often, rich countries have a myopic approach to global forced displacement and population movements, focusing overwhelmingly on border controls. Such challenges are rarely treated with the necessary strategic approach. They're seen as either someone else's problem or something unmanageable to deal with when it reaches domestic borders or shores. The reality is that simple slogans like stop the boats are no more effective a solution to this challenge than those that say, let them all in. What I'm therefore proposing is rather a set of policies and interventions that work together as part of an all-of-government strategy with international cooperation at its heart. None of these suggestions are on their own a silver bullet, nor are they simple. They will require policymakers to use different tools available both at home and abroad. And they will take, I dare say, a bit of political courage. From politicians, of course, but also from organizations like mine that must remain principled in defending international law and morality, which is why I, as UN High Commissioner for Refugees, can never accept sealing borders to asylum seekers or externalizing a state's asylum obligations. At the same time, however, we must also help states deal with these challenges in ways that are pragmatic, concrete, and creative. The foundation of this approach is that states must work together to meet their responsibilities as members of the international community. It is also crucial to address the practice that unfortunately I see too often in different countries of demonizing refugees and migrants by portraying them as the cause, for example, of unemployment, of insecurity, of the erosion in values. Scapegoating, misinformation, and hate speech are simply unacceptable. As one advocate told me here in Australia the other day, changing how we deal with refugees starts with changing the way we speak about them. The approach also requires, for lack of a better word, a panoramic view of population movements, moving away from the almost obsessive focus on just controlling arrivals at borders, to looking at their geographical complexity, literally at all steps of the long migratory routes. Surely, movement across borders, including sea borders, will continue to be a challenge. A big priority, therefore, is to ensure the rescue of people on the move that are in distress, adrift at sea or lost in deserts. Evading responsibilities and allowing people to die en route, as happens too often, is simply inhumane. Access to seek asylum at borders without being turned away or violently pushed back, which happens increasingly, must also be granted. For those who seek asylum and protection, their cases must be heard and adjudicated. For countries like Australia and others, this means ensuring that the system is sufficiently resourced and that the process and procedures for deciding cases are effective. The system, however, must be both fair and efficient and also rigorous, ensuring protection for those who need it and the quick return in dignity and in compliance with their human rights of those who do not. And in places with suitable safeguards, readmission agreements, meaning sending refugees back to a country where they have already sought asylum, can be made. Such a system will also restore public confidence in discredited asylum systems. It will enable states to send an important message that while they will continue to extend international protection to those who need it, their systems are able to identify and return in a dignified manner those who do not qualify for it, thus hopefully weakening traffickers. And another crucial point is the need, especially in industrialized countries, for an honest conversation about establishing proper, legal, substantive migration pathways to keep economies and social systems going, and to provide proper entry points for migrants without overburdening the asylum channel. I'm pleased to hear that Australia is committed to reform in this area. But contemporary population movements cannot simply be addressed when they reach the border of rich countries. It is important to look upstream as well. This means building and strengthening asylum systems, inclusion, and sometimes integration mechanisms in countries closer to places of origin so that they can provide the protection that refugees lack at home. This, of course, is core to UNHCR's work around the world, but it needs much more support. And for those countries that host the bulk of the refugees, most frequently next to the epicenter of the crisis, we need much more responsibility sharing from the rest of the world. This can take many forms. Resettlement, the process of taking recognized refugees from one country of asylum to a third country, is one important and visible way to share responsibility. It establishes a life-saving, life-changing pathway for the most vulnerable and takes space away from the traffickers. Australia has always been a leader in resettlement. I was really pleased to hear from the government that the program will be strengthened. Other avenues like scholarships, work visas, pathways for work, study, the arts, sport, as well as family reunification should be explored with the same vigor and generosity we have seen for resettlement. But these pathways will inevitably be limited. Most refugees will stay where they are. Hence the importance of supporting them and their host communities, especially in countries with large refugee numbers, or with help, information, assessments in transit countries. Contributions to humanitarian responses, including through UNHCR, are crucial. Donors, including Australia, have been generous, but our budget is hardly ever more than 50% funded. Equally important is to include refugees in national services, for example, education and health, and to properly resource those systems, especially in countries that do not have many resources. A real game changer, especially since the launch of the Global Compact on Refugees in 2018, has been the growing involvement of major development actors like the World Bank and other international financial institutions. We estimate that they now contribute more than $5 billion every year in direct assistance to large refugee hosting countries that have good inclusive policies. This strengthens their national services, including for host communities, and helps them cope rather than being overstretched by the additional refugee demands. Another important development has been the involvement of the private sector, both as philanthropic givers and as real partners in the responses. The Australian private sector played a critical role in this over the past years, with our national partner, Australia for UNHCR, having recorded almost 500,000 Australian donors over the past 2 decades, as well as numerous companies that participate in real partnerships, bringing expertise and know-how to refugees' responses around the world. In fact, generations of Australians across the political spectrum and from all sections of society have been remarkably generous towards refugees, donating funds, doing volunteer work, holding out a helping hand. In other words, when people meet refugees, when they hear their stories, when they understand what they have gone through, solidarity always is strong. Civil society in Australia and globally plays a pivotal and catalytic role to fill gaps, including gaps vacated by governments, forming partnerships, and promoting community understanding. Better informing the public discourse is an area that has also been well supported by academia, particularly here in Australia. We saw this clearly with the broad-based engagement in advocacy and support around Afghanistan, for example, in 2021, a true all-of-society response. Of critical importance, increasingly, I'm pleased to say, is the work of refugee-led organizations that can provide much-needed reality check to our efforts. But while all of this is vitally important, we must not forget that it is states that have the ultimate responsibility to address the root causes driving people from their homes. This means global cooperation to prevent and resolve conflicts, of course, but also urgent action to address the climate emergency, as well as to improve governance, equality, respect for human rights, and other factors of fragility. These must be addressed in the political realm. But in the meantime, there are also things we can do in countries of origin of these flows, including some that are not fully at peace, to support those who make that difficult decision to go home, even before UNHCR can encourage returns. Think of South Sudan or Burundi. Thousands have returned to both in the past years, but what are they returning to? How sustainable can be their return when there is a lack of services like shelter, water, schools, health clinics? While we advocate return that is informed and, of course, voluntary, we must accept that the pull of home is strong, and we must do much more to support those who do make that difficult choice. This means earlier, greater, and yes, riskier investments in countries that are still fragile, one of the greatest challenges of our time. Complex population movements, therefore, can only be resolved through what I would call an all-of-root approach. Many of these aspects, responsibility sharing, self-reliance, third country solutions, improving conditions in countries of origin, are very important components of the Global Compact on Refugees, which will be reviewed and furthered by actions, hopefully to be announced at next December's Global Refugee Forum in Geneva, where we will count on Australia, the government and civil society, for active support and engagement. So, dear friends, what I have laid out today is not simple. It is not something that can be packaged into soundbite that wins elections. It is even, perhaps, a little technical, a little boring. I appreciate that. But to quote the great Chinese artist Ai Weiwei, I quote him, "The refugee crisis is not about refugees. It is about us and our choices." So ours is an appeal to policymakers and politicians, a set of interventions that together can help address one of the global challenges of our time, that of forced displacement. If refugees and forced displacement are complex matters, then let us embrace complexity and deal with it. Results will not be immediate and will require courage, commitment, compassion, and determination. But it is either that or we stumble into the future unprepared. Thank you.
Thank you so much, High Commissioner, for that inspiring and thoughtful reflection. I'm very pleased now to introduce the moderator for today's discussion, Erika Feller, AO. Erika is a Professorial Fellow in the Melbourne School of Government and the Chair of the Advisory Board of the Peter McMullin Centre on Statelessness. From 2005 to 2013, Erika held the post of Assistant High Commissioner Protection, one of the 4 top management positions within the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. This was the culmination of a 26-year-long career with UNHCR and had been preceded by 14 years' service as an Australian diplomat in Canberra and overseas. Thank you so much for being with us today, Erika.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for those kind words of introduction. It is such a pleasure to have you here, Filippo. Filippo and I have known each other for many, many years, and I've watched with tremendous admiration his career take off. I remember in the early days when we both served under a High Commissioner, Japanese High Commissioner, Mrs. Ogata. She identified Filippo when he was just a very young professional as somebody who was going to go very far, very fast to places. And he was one of these young achievers at the Davos meeting that is held every year in Switzerland. And how right was Mrs. Ogata? I'm so glad I was able to encourage you. I know you didn't need much encouragement and you've always been very enthusiastic about coming to Australia, but to encourage you to just get on that awfully long flight and make your way here. And I think we owe him and his team who have come with him, a lot of thanks, because it's a very short visit for a very long way to come. But I know it was important that he came at this time, particularly when so many things are happening in Australia. What we thought would be the way we would handle this time that we've got left, which unfortunately is relatively short, was that I would just put a couple of questions that occurred to me when I was listening to Filippo to him, and hope that we will get some interesting answers in response, and then open the floor to all of you there. Some of you, I'm sure, will have questions that you'll want to answer, so we'll leave some time and space for that. But without further ado, Filippo, I want to firstly thank you for speaking with such passion and clarity, as I know you always do, and really laying out a road ahead for refugee protection and refugee assistance in the period to come. Now, the question that really leapt to me when I listened to Filippo, though, was who is going to walk that road? We have seen over many years asylum fatigue on the part of a lot of countries. We've seen the closing of humanitarian space in many countries. Legislation has become a lot more restrictive. The situation in the Mediterranean is dire, but not only there. And a lot of borders have been closing in tandem with the sorts of things that Filippo has been telling us about. So as somebody who has this tremendously long professional experience working in the humanitarian area, you will have seen many changes in relation to states' attitudes to refugees, attitudes to displacement. Maybe you would like to take us through some of those changes which you've witnessed over the years and give us your best bet on whether we are just on a constant downward spiral or whether there will be takers for these various suggestions you've made, and they really will actually lead to major changes over the period to come. I hope it's going to be a positive answer on that, Filippo.
No pressure. Yeah, thanks, Erika. I would say, maybe divided quickly into two parts. There is a less positive part to the answer, I think, and and you said it yourself, there has been a downward spiral, unfortunately, because like I tried to explain, you have, on the one hand, vastly increased mobility of populations. And this is because of many, many reasons, not just refugees moving, but many other people moving regularly, irregularly, and many facilities to move, legal and illegal, the pool of technology, information, everything conspires in a way to facilitate large movements of people. And in a context in which, unfortunately, let's call a spade, some politicians have identified in these movements, especially when part of them, a small part of them, arrives in rich countries, they have identified that as a powerful electoral argument, right? Portraying these people as threats brings you vote. Unfortunately, this works in our sometimes irrational political sphere, especially, like I said, in industrialized countries. We've seen it here, we've seen it in Europe, We've seen it in North America, and we increasingly see it in other places as well, because there are other countries that rise to prosperity and become a pull factor. In Asia, for example, so I mentioned South Africa and other places. So that's the context. It's a difficult one, in which, of course, the proposals, the measures taken very often violate laws, violate human rights, are abusive, etc., etc. So that's one aspect. I would say, and this is something that my colleagues and I have been saying for some time, sometimes the voice of reason is slower in having effect than the voice of emotion and non-reason. But the voice of reason say, look at all these responses, the walls, putting people on some other people's islands, pushbacks, they happen everywhere. In the end, that coupled with the negative rhetoric, does it solve the problem? It doesn't. Even if you see this as a problem, which I'm trying to say maybe we shouldn't, but even if you see it as a problem, it doesn't solve the problem. People continue to arrive, movements continue to happen, they actually increase. So I think that this is the way forward, to show that this is not a positive, constructive answer to the challenge of these movements, and that the positive answers are more complicated. They may gain less votes in the immediate horizon, but in the end, they can be more effective. This is why I think that after all, this famous compact on refugees that we developed in past years, and we put to states in 2018, was actually almost overwhelmingly approved by states, because I think states understood what it was. It was, what I described here is not so different from the compact in a way. It's a toolbox of different tools that states have to deal with population movements from the beginning to the end. This panoramic, this all of the root approach. And I think that this is my hope, my space of hope. Now we're having this forum coming up at the end of the year. The first forum we did just after the compact was quite successful. Many pledges were good. Many pledges were actually implemented by states. I'm not just talking about money, I'm talking about policies, I'm talking about new initiatives. There was this huge participation of the private sector, of development organizations. So this new direction, it gives rise to some optimism. Again, when you open internet, or if somebody still opens a newspaper, I don't know, you will still hear much of the negative noise. Don't be scared by that. If you're convinced that there is a positive way forward, look at the smaller and more, maybe a little bit more boring script. That's where we have to go.
Well, I think that's a very positive message, Filippo. And before we open the floor, I just wanted to point out that we have quite a number of young people in the audience, many students, not only, but many students as well. And you have had these great discussions with government officials, with civil society, with refugee groups. You may not have had the opportunity yet to interact too much with the younger generation, the ones full of enthusiasm and hope who will read the small script and will hopefully act on it. Just would you have any messages to those people here in the audience, how they can actually buy in to your road ahead? What kind of things can the youth of the world contribute to better refugee protection and a better environment for refugees?
I have a few, some advice I have. I would say, first of all, become and stay engaged in this. And I say engage in what, actually? I should be a bit more specific. I tried to say this at the beginning of my presentation or my speech. Forced migration, refugees, this is one of several global challenges that we have to face. There's also climate change. There are many challenges related to poverty and inequality, which I think are still very fundamental in today's world. There are challenges related to peacemaking, to international politics. So my advice to young people is these global challenges no matter how much politicians will tell you they're not relevant to your daily lives, they're very relevant to your daily lives. Either because your neighbor will be a refugee or because climate change affects all of us. I mean, I don't need to give you examples. So it is important to engage. It is important to engage locally in your community, but it is also important to engage globally for those who have that, inclination to do so. So engage in that at whatever level, be very engaged, and don't lose hope. I think this is linked to your previous question, because unfortunately the signals are not good. Even when you talk about climate change, this is not my expertise, but of course I follow, like all of us. Look at how slow the world is in making the right commitments to reducing emissions, to really looking at how we can put resources in the right places to offset the impact of that. The discussion is very difficult. Why? Because why is it so difficult? Because unfortunately, the political rhetoric is also all about my country first. This my country first is terrible because it is so useless. It's not only wrong, let's not discuss that. Some people may think otherwise, but I think everybody has to agree how useless it is. So engage in, contribute to making the fight for these causes truly a collective fight. And I would also say this applies also to your own political engagement. All of us, at least all of us who have the extreme fortune to live in democracies, as you have here in Australia, have a political responsibility, and that is to vote. Now, I am not going to say for whom you have to vote. I would be very wrong if I did that. That's not my job. But I say always to young people, when you go to an election, whether it is local or national, or in my continent, continental, look at, vote for candidates who do care for global challenges and who do stand up, whatever their political color, for those global challenges, who promote international cooperation as opposed to my country first, to me first, to the selfish approach to politics. Support that, because that vote is very, very important, because it will translate eventually into decision-making that can change the course of action.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that there are many young people in the audience today who have listened very carefully to that and will take it to heart and will act on it. Now, we have 3 questions, 3 hands up for the moment. We're going to have to, please don't just ask the questions very clearly, just the questions, not too much narrative around the questions, because we won't have very much time otherwise. I start with the woman up there.
Thank you. Thank you, High Commissioner, for your presentation today and a very thorough description of the impact of this placement on human lives. I myself grew up in a war zone and ended up in Australia as a child as a result. So the topic is very personal to me. One thing I heard you say, morality, international law, there was a lot of preservation of the dignity of people and their rights to safety. What was missing whilst you skirted around the issue, and I appreciate there's political diplomacy involved in this. As you mentioned, there's a downward spiral globally, so I feel like we need to move a bit beyond political diplomacy. What I'd like to hear more about is the unpacking of the ideologies that for the last 200 years have driven invasion of land, theft of resources, and the displacement of people. And that ideology is white supremacy and racism and underpinned by patriarchal rule. Is there space in the UN to address that, to unpack it, and to really have an honest conversation globally about that?
Okay, thank you. I understand the question, and I'll ask Filippo to answer it in a minute. I might take a couple more and group them if you would agree, just so that we can get as many out there. But that's really about racism and what the UN is doing about racism. The gentleman over there, yes.
Thank you very much. It seems that certain individuals, groups, and countries have high levels of empathy towards refugees, while some have zero or little empathy. My question is, what are the reasons which contributes to this variance in attitude towards empathy? Is it a meme or is it this underlying psychological trait? For example, a quick cursory glance around the room shows that males are outnumbered by females. Thank you.
Most of the room is female. Thank you. I'll take one more question and then we will... Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Filippo. Thank you. I'm Steph Cousins from Talent Beyond Boundaries. We work a lot with UNHCR and your team on complementary pathways, and particularly the labour pathways. And it seems like the end of the year with the Global Forum, the Global Refugee Forum is just such a huge opportunity to achieve more ambition, not just with complementary pathways, but a number of the innovative solutions that are coming down the line. And I'm interested in what your views are about the key outcomes that you want to see from that forum, the practical outcomes that you want to see.
Okay, thank you very much. Filippo?
So maybe I won't take them in the same order, but perhaps, first of all, on the imbalance, if I understood the question correctly, there are many reasons for this, right? Like I explained or tried to explain in my statement, of course, the bulk of the refugee responsibility, we don't like to call it burden, but the responsibility is with the countries that are closest to the crisis. This is a hazard of geography or history that places a country next to another one at war and another one much further away. The one further away is less likely to get more refugees than the one closest. That's why there is almost a mechanical imbalance that needs to be corrected through other means. If the countries further away have the means, they need to help more the countries that is closest and receives more refugees. This is the famous burden sharing that is so much talked about. And resettlement is another one. Now, resettlement, is a small solution. I think that in any given year, we hardly ever resettle more than 1% of the total number of refugees in the world. Is very, very small. But it is an important gesture of responsibility sharing. Richer countries that say to countries with less resources, okay, you host 2 million people, we'll take some to our country. It's also good because usually those people that are resettled are very vulnerable, so there are multiple advantages. So these are some ways to somehow reset this imbalance. But we're very far from really resetting this imbalance. When I am in front of states, and usually the states that are in front of me are either donor countries or countries hosting refugees, I feel the tension. The host countries say, we are the ones with the biggest burden. We are the biggest donors too, because we donate land and resources to the people coming to our country. And it's true. And so our job, the job of UNHCR, is try to balance that. And that brings me to the Global Refugee Forum, because the compact had this responsibility sharing as its, thread throughout all of the Global Compact on Refugees sounds very big thing, is a few pages of fairly easy reading. I recommend that it is done because it answers many of these questions. And I think this is the ambition. Through this fora, we have one every 4 years, hopefully it will go on, through this fora, somehow push countries to do more responsibility sharing. The forum, you ask what we expect, the forum results in a number of what we call pledges. It's not just money, as I said, it's many things. What we're really trying to say to states is, if Australia, which is a big donor country, makes pledges, can it make pledge with the countries hosting many refugees that, for example, allows those refugees to have access to its education system? Because that poorer country that opens up its schools to refugees, and many do, they deserve support to the education system. So there could be a good match, as we call it, which would be a good example of responsibility sharing. You may think I'm a bit idealistic. Yeah, I have to be a little bit idealistic, otherwise I can't go on. But it's actually quite practical. And the first forum had few number of matching pledges. We have many more now. And we are even talking about mega pledges where many countries will pledge together around education, for example, or access to healthcare or documentation, the key issues that you need to do for refugees, with a strong attention also for communities hosting them that sometimes are as poor, if not poorer, than the refugees. So this is all part of this responsibility sharing. On the points raised by the first speaker, I would say, first of all, yes, I did not speak about everything. There could be many, many, many other things that one can speak about. Why the world is in this rather sorry state, that would be the subject of many lectures, if we did it. And
You have to come again.
I have to come again. And maybe after ending my job as High Commissioner for Refugees, because then you can speak about many things. Now, I would say on those that you mentioned, exploitation, colonialism, racism, you mentioned this gender imbalance. I think these are all important factors. I could speak to you about what we do to address these issues in the context in which we work. There is no doubt that racism is a powerful cause for flight in many places. I can give you many, many examples where communities are discriminated against and persecuted and have to flee. And that persecution, that discrimination is very much linked to racism. But then, of course, there is a more global, we live in a very unequal world. And certainly that inequality, that those imbalances are also rooted in exploitation and racism. So those are surely important points. The UN is actually engaged in that. Do we make a lot of progress? That is more difficult to say. There are themes that the Secretary General and the leadership of the UN takes up from very different respective point of views of the different organizations of the United Nations, but they are very important ones. And themes that, unfortunately, if I may say one more point that is also relevant to our work, have found a new lease on life because, for example, of social media that are a powerful catalyst and vehicle for racism and abuse, etc., including, we have seen it in many countries to stigmatize communities, people, and so forth. But I just want to make a final remark, because you said at the beginning that you understand that political diplomacy prevents me to talk about certain things, from talking about certain things. Well, first of all, I think I tried to be as clear as I could on a number of issues. And then second, can I make a little pitch in favor of political diplomacy? It is a very important tool. I always say, especially when I speak to young people, I always quote an evangelical, I share an evangelical, a quote from the gospel. And there is, a moment in which the gospel says, you have to be, if I'm not mistaken, as smart as a snake and as innocent as a dove, right? So you have to be innocent and speak out, but you have to do it as smart as a snake. Because if you're not smart in your advocacy, in your work, especially when you do the type of work that we do in UNHCR, which is really practical, operational work, often that work is advocacy, speaking out. Often, or equally often, if not more often, that work is negotiation. Erika knows very well. She headed our protection work for many years. That's the most important part of UNHCR work. And a lot of that work is negotiations, is quiet, shrewd, careful negotiation, trying to find space. But that space can be vital, literally, for millions of people. So let's not discount diplomacy. It is still a very important tool in our toolbox.
Well, I think that obviously fell on fertile ground, those comments, and unfortunately we don't have any more time for questions. I know there are many out there, but Filippo has to move on to his next diplomatic discussion, and that's also very important. So I think on that note, I will pass the floor back to Michelle, and she will make some closing comments. But it's been a great privilege for me to share the podium again with you, Filippo.
Thank you so much to all of you for such a rich and engaged discussion. We could clearly speak with the High Commissioner for hours. Unfortunately, we don't have that time, but hopefully we can entice you to come back to Australia. I'd now like to welcome Hannah Amin to the stage to offer a vote of thanks on behalf of the Peter McMullin Centre on Statelessness. Hannah is a third-year Juris Doctor student here in the law school and is currently enrolled in the Stateless Legal Clinic, directed by my wonderful colleague, Katie Robertson, who established this first-of-its-kind initiative. The clinic offers Juris Doctor students the opportunity to work with Katie and our partners at the Refugee Advice Casework Service to assist stateless children born in Australia to realise their right to nationality. The clinic also partners with Refugee Legal to assist stateless adults with various legal issues. Hannah tells us that she was inspired to apply for the clinic given her Kurdish heritage. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you, Michelle. I feel so honoured to be standing before you all today. On behalf of the students at Melbourne Law School and my colleagues at the Stateless Legal Clinic, I'd like to extend my gratitude to the High Commissioner for being with us today in this corner of the world and for such insightful discussions. Thank you also to Erika for your masterful chairing of this event. High Commissioner Mr. Grandi, the UNHCR's commitment to addressing statelessness and global displacement resonates on a personal level for me. As Michelle just mentioned, I am of Kurdish background. This is something that I take great pride in. Being Kurdish, you are born stateless, without the protections of belonging to any recognised country and the fundamental rights that stem from that. My parents and I made the journey to Australia as refugees in 2000. At first, it wasn't easy. But a few years after this, our family was granted Australian citizenship. This opened doors to a life of dignity and security, the ability to enjoy the many benefits that come from being recognised as a citizen. But as a former stateless refugee, I'm only too aware of the opportunities that many in this world simply do not have. This is what drives me to use the opportunities that I've been given in this life to help others, especially children, access their rights to live with security and safety. Your speech here today, High Commissioner, reminds us of the very real challenges that lie ahead. However, echoing what you've said earlier, there is hope in global collective action. We must all, inclusive of those who have lived as refugees or stateless people, continue to support one another towards a fairer and more promising world for all. Thank you. And we've also have a few gifts for you on behalf of the school.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I'd now like to welcome the Dean of Melbourne Law School, Professor Matthew Harding, to formally close the event. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Michelle. I'll be brief. High Commissioner, you honour us with your presence here today. Thank you very much indeed for the time you spent this morning in the Peter McMullin Centre for Statelessness and the clinic, and of course for your address to us now. Hannah, thank you for the vote of thanks and for speaking with the voice of lived experience as well as academic and political interest in this topic. It underscores that notwithstanding the magnitude and the complexity of the problems that the High Commissioner has laid before us, and notwithstanding the complexity and the many dimensions of the solutions, the moral imperatives that sit across it are crystal clear, to do with the dignity of every human being and the common humanity that we all share. Thank you to some of our colleagues here today who have worked very, very hard to make this event happen. Of course, to Michelle, to Katie, to the whole team in the Peter McMullin Centre for the huge effort that went into the day's program. Thank you. Thank you to Erika, for your leadership in helping this event to take shape. Thank you to the staff in the UNHCR Canberra office for your role in today's program as well. Thank you to Pip in the centre. Thank you to Marina and Casper and Greta, who support events here at the Melbourne Law School, for the very hard work you've done. And to any I've forgotten, forgive me, but thank you. And thanks to all of you for being here today. This is a wonderful attendance, and we're very grateful to you for coming. The only other thing that remains for me to do is to invite you to join us for refreshments, which are, I think, being served outside just here for the next while, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you again, and have a pleasant afternoon.